Howdy peeps, hope everyone's doing well. So it's been quite a little while since I've done a video, and I guess this is a bit of a, not an update as such, but most definitely a reminder of the roots of where my channel actually started out. All the way back in 2015, or well, late 2015 to early 2016, and experiences with a toxic woman. Fuck me, was she toxic. And I'm sure a lot of you guys out there will be able to appreciate that, you know, because I dare say, for the most part, a lot of guys that end up going their own way, go their own way because of what they went through. It's a retreat. It is a get away from it all. Now, whether you want to swear off women completely, swear off relationships completely, well, that's just a personal choice. Unfortunately, one of the things that I do see within MGTOW is if you go against the narrative, or if you have something to say that doesn't quite fit their view of life, well, unfortunately, oftentimes you'll find yourself on the receiving end of quite a bit of bullshittery, in my opinion. Now, sure, there are a lot of guys out there who are very, disenfranchised or disheartened by the whole idea of someone else being able to achieve something that they cannot. But let's talk about the roots of narcissistic behaviour. Now, in plain, it is just a case of selfishness, and a combination of that and someone having a relatively fragile ego. And more often than not, they're unable to accept the consequences of their actions, because that too ironically hurts their ego. So I want to talk a bit about the sort of things that go on within toxic abusive relationships. And I'm not necessarily referring to abusive in the sense of physical abuse, although this obviously can be a thing too in some circumstances. But when you look at it for the core of what it is, a lot of the time is these people just have no respect for you. But what's worse yet is they have no respect for themselves, and they tend to project out onto others their own insecurities. So I've got a couple of quotes here that I want to read out to you guys. For those of you that are considering going back into the dating world, I know that in reality it's probably going to be few and far between, but I know that there are guys out there that do want to go back into the dating market, and they do actually want to find someone. And like I've said before, for some, MGTOW is just a passing place. But it also comes down to having a level of self-respect, and more importantly, being able to pay attention to the red flags that crop up as you go through life. And you won't necessarily just see this in romantic relationships, you'll also see it in everyday relationships as well. And my advice is always going to be the same. You know, this, as the saying goes, people will only treat you the way in which you invite them to treat you. So if someone badmouths you to your face and puts you down, if you stick around that person, you're engaging in the rules of engagement with that one, in that you're accepting that it's okay for them to do that. Now, obviously, it's not. But if you participate in it, then you are quite literally enabling their shitty behaviour towards you. And you don't come out feeling particularly good in the long run. So the first quote is, avoid people who, 1, mess with your head. 2, intentionally and repeatedly do and say things that they know upset you. 3, expect you to prioritise them but refuse to prioritise you. 4, and this is an important one, can't and won't apologise sincerely. Now, on that one, it's very easy for any random person to say they're sorry. You know, if they've done something, if they've crossed a boundary, or they've said something a bit out of turn that may have hurt another. Now, oftentimes there are people out there who do just say things, and, you know, it just sort of comes out a bit wrong. We all do it. Well, I definitely do it. But the point I'm getting at is, when you do wrong someone, is being able to apologise, mean it, and be sincere about it. rather than just saying sorry for the sake of patching up a wound that you've caused, and maybe deep down you don't really care too much about it, you know, the feelings of the other person. And the fifth one is, now this is the all-important one, act like the victim when confronted with their abusive behaviour. Now this is something that I will say you will notice a lot within narcissistic behaviour. It's basically what it comes down to. Now, to kind of go through it, if you're going to be talking about people messing with your head, well, there's a saying that you might also recognise out there. Well, it's a term called stonewalling, and it consists of, and this, by the way, will help you determine whether you're in a toxic relationship with someone. So stonewalling consists of refusal to negotiate a conflict in good faith. Now, obviously, in the terms of an argument or a disagreement, whether it's a disagreement of viewpoint or whatever, well then, it does take both parties to, you know, well, exactly that, negotiate a resolution, you know, to compromise. Now, some things I get it. Some people can't compromise on because it might just be down to personal circumstances and it is the way that it is. But if it's something that's done within a friendship or a relationship of some form, then a lot of time people will be able to negotiate a conflict and work through it. After all, that's the whole idea of having a good, decent relationship. Refusal to discuss honestly one's motivations. Again, this is something that we do see quite a lot of within people with personality disorders of some form. Although that's not to say that it's just strictly limited to. After all, you might find someone that is passive-aggressive. Again, not necessarily the most healthy of relationships to have either, because of the way they conduct themselves. A lot of the time, they're not being honest with their motivations, and oftentimes they are unwilling to discuss it. Goes back to the first one as well. Refusal to negotiate a conflict in good faith. The third bullet point is refusal to listen to another point of view with openness. Again, this is another narcissistic trait, if you ask me. And it does come down to exactly that. Now, we do see a lot of people that are just quite set in their ways and they're quite closed off. And like I've said, often prefer to blame others for their own conflict or their own way of being. The next one is refusal to compromise. Well, compromising should happen with any kind of relationship anyway, whether it's a friendship, romantic, business, partnership or whatever. They're all relatively important. You have to be able to reach compromises in these kind of relationships. If not, it's one-sided, and if you're willing to put your halfway forward and the other person is unwilling to meet you halfway, then there's a bit of a problem. A refusal to collaborate is also quite an important point as well. After all, it does take collaboration in order to meet the compromise. And of course, going back over the others, you know, being able to listen to another person and their point of view with openness. A refusal to support the other person's plans. Now, this is very important within relationships of all kinds. You see, if we're to get along as a society, and I get it, a lot of people have no interest in getting along with society. Perhaps they've got their own personal issues, you know, maybe the way they were treated or something. But realistically speaking, in any kind of relationship, you're supposed to be able to support the other person's plans. That is the idea of a relationship. And then lastly is a refusal to accept influence. Again, because we all influence each other's lives in one way or another. Whether it's something that you say, or a viewpoint that you may have, or even a life view that you may have. But realistically speaking, if you then obviously flip and switch, or switch and bait, as we call it, then yeah, there's a bit of a problem with that. The next saying relates to all of the above, and it does come with its own set of problems. Sociopaths use stonewalling as an easy way to get rid of someone they're finished with. So needless to say, if you've been in a situation where the other person is refusing to negotiate a conflict in good faith, refuses to discuss honestly one's motivations, refuses to listen to another person's point of view with openness, refuses to compromise, refuses to collaborate, and refuses to support the other person's plans, but more importantly, refusal to accept any influence, in other words, the part that they were playing. Now I get it. Oftentimes it's a bit of a difficult scenario, especially if you've been on the receiving end of some kind of toxic behaviour in a relationship. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean a lover, it could mean friends, it could mean family, or a boss, or a co-worker. But I've got another saying that I want to talk about in this one as well. When someone walks away after you stand up for yourself and then stonewalls you for days, weeks, months, or years, that is not normal. It's abusive. And here's the double twist with that one. You see, sometimes you might find yourself in conflict. I'm assuming, of course, that you do come from a good place and have the best intentions, and I mean literally best intentions. And I'm not referencing that to best intentions being the path paved to hell. But realistically speaking, if you do come across someone that is, I suppose we can call them relatively sociopathic, or that they do use stonewalling as a means to get by, because they're unwilling to meet the other person on the other half, on the halfway sort of thing, meet that compromise, well then, sometimes you do kind of, even once you put your point of view across, and your explanation across, or whatever the situation was, and you see that there is no way around this, and then the best thing that you really can do is in fact walk away. And here's the problem with that, is oftentimes these people that may have some kind of sociopathic or narcissistic tendencies will tend to switch and bait the fact that you walked away from a situation, calling you the abusive one, putting you in the position of, I suppose, being the attacker, as it were. Again, people often do this from a very passive-aggressive point of view. You know, they will tell you all sorts of things like, you know, they were watching their tone, or they may even go as far as gaslighting you, you know, which is another very important sort of thing to bear in mind, the whole how gaslighting works, which is basically just a case of messing with your head, telling you a scenario happened a certain way when it didn't, or you get told that you said something in a certain way and you might not have. Yeah, it's kind of interesting, really. Oftentimes you might find yourself, if you're in a relationship, recording conversations to listen back to them to see if you were being to check your tone and what was said. Now, as soon as you start doing that, make no mistake, you're already being gaslit, and you're probably being gaslighted for quite some time prior to that happening. Now, sure, you could argue that, well, maybe this is something that generally tends to happen more in personal romantic relationship than it does in, say, perhaps between friends. I mean, if you're having to record your friends because you're being gaslit, needless to say, they're not your friends, and the best thing that you can do is get as far away from them as possible. But with that comes a level of codependency. But not just codependency, but also cognitive dissonance, which is another sort of topic to do with narcissistic behavioural patterns and people that are attracted to them, which I find somewhat kind of ironic. Oftentimes people confuse the codependent, or shall I say, they confuse the narcissists themselves as being the codependent, where a lot of times they're not. It is just another kind of cover-up. In other words, they play the victim in certain scenarios, and you do end up feeling sorry for them. Now, a lot of guys that have found themselves in these situations, well, they try to fix the other person, don't they? But realistically speaking, you can't fix the other person. You can't go around fixing other people. They are who they are. Their problems are exactly that. Their problems. And it's not your priority, nor is it your responsibility to go around trying to fix them. Oftentimes all you'll find is you go around in circles, getting nowhere, and just cause yourself a headache, a heartache in some cases. Yeah, the financial loss isn't even that important at the end of the day. The money can be made back if you spent money over time, but ultimately you got to take care of you. If that does mean for you walking away from relationships, then fine, fair enough. Do your thing, whatever floats your boat. But realistically speaking, you got to really pay attention to what people tell you, the story that they tell you, the story that they tell themselves. And this is something that I think is of great importance, and something that a lot of people weren't taught or haven't been taught. Oftentimes because they've been used to being in that kind of a scenario themselves, whether it was brought up by toxic parents or toxic family members, or just brought up in a, generally speaking, toxic environment where it sort of becomes the norm. And so they end up running around in a life full of drama, constantly putting themselves out for others while receiving not a great deal in return. But there are exceptions to that rule. They're not receiving things in return. Sometimes you do. But you have to ask yourself, did it really come from the heart of the other person? Or was it something that they did just so they could use it further on down the line? Again, another gaslight, so to speak. Well, I hope you've found this video informative in some way, shape or form. I know it's not one of my it is kind of one of my usual topics from years back. But I'm just doing my bit to try and help other guys out there that have found themselves in these situations. And it's about understanding what you went through, psychologically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually more than anything. Because some of these people really do have an ability to be able to crush your spirit. And that's the one thing you can't allow to happen. You can't let other people crush your spirit. Thanks all for listening. Thoughts, comments or opinions, feel free to jot them down as always. And until the next one, stay cool, stay free, and peace out.